Good morning. It's actually a bit late. It's almost 8 o'clock in the morning, although I was up fairly early. Putting together the images that I use in support of these entries takes a while. My 11th year anniversary is coming up very soon on the 10th. I count it from the day that I had a reading with a psychic medium in March 10 of 2010. So I'm going to go into some of the evidence for that. I'm going to go through that entire psychic reading and show you how accurate the psychic actually was. I'm not going to go too much into the personal stuff because we probably have some skeptics watching this, and you don't want to drag out your personal life too much in front of strangers. So I thought I'd go into the evidence. This is going to take us a little bit far afield, and as a matter of fact, it's going to touch on my topic, the last couple of entries, which has to do with George Burnham's plagiarism of Matthew Franklin Whittier's work, and a few other things. So this is going to be kind of a twisted path here. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't care. I think we have 3 viewers for the last couple, but they'll go up. I still haven't seen any sign of Real Paranormal Magazine UK coming out. They're they're new at this business, and I think they're kind of struggling with the technical issues. So that's fine. Where are we going to start? Let's see. I had a psychic reading many years ago with a woman named Candace Zellner, who worked, and for all I know still works, out of the Phoenix and Dragon bookstore in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was living. And I don't know how many I had, maybe 2 or something like that. One of them was for myself, and one of them was for one of my reincarnation subjects, which I'll get into in a minute. The one for myself, she started right out saying, "Has anybody ever told you you were a rabbi?" And I said, "No." She says, "Well, you have rabbi all over you," she says. That was the first thing. And it so happens that Matthew, when he started being open-minded about reincarnation, which was around 1850, he would have been 38 or something like that. He actually began to drop hints that he had been a high Jewish priest in a past life. Now, almost for sure, this was something that was told to him in a reading, because Matthew was very much involved in the 1850s in spiritualism. Some of those people, although most spiritualists were from the traditional Christian background and did not believe in reincarnation, some of them did, I'm sure, and he would have had readings from people like that. So I'm going to show you in the Portland transcript of 1857, my mouse over there, this is the 1857 Portland transcript, and in here is, let's see, this is the May 30, 1857 edition. There is a letter from Old Casual. Now, you've seen the Piscatorian Brotherhood. If you've watched all of these, you've seen that Matthew had earlier adopted that style of the man searching for the free and easy. So here we have Old Casual. And this is a character he briefly created, which was designed to address the issue of his character, Ethan Spike, having been outed. He was outed as the author of this character, apparently about this time in mid-1857. It ruined his career. As near as I can tell, he was blacklisted after this. I don't know who exposed him. I have some theories. We don't need to go into that. But this is clearly Matthew speaking to a bunch of sailors and characters on an island. Pigeon Hill he's at in Maine. And he is writing the way Ethan Spike writes. He's writing as though he knows Ethan Spike personally. So this is his little inside joke, and it's not the first time, because I've told you that as Quails, he pretended to have met Ethan Spike. So it's definitely Matthew. There's no question about it. But here's the way it starts out. "Gentlemen, sirs, editors, and town clerks, for I see you are publishers. My business ain't to get published, for thank George, I've been through that trying ordeal and come out double. Now, who do you think he's referring to? I thought at first he was referring to George Light, but this is much closer in time to George Burnham having plagiarized him, see? And we're talking about The Rag Picker, which I just referred to, and a whole bunch of other work earlier. Look at the wording. He doesn't say by George. Everybody says by George. He says thank George. Okay? I've been through that trying ordeal of getting published and come out double. This is a reference in code, and I keep telling you that Matthew used code all the time. This is a coded reference to George Burnham having plagiarized him. Okay, so it's another little smoking gun in here that Matthew left posterity. See? So that's fine, but then we get down to about where he talks about Ethan Spike. Now he says that Ethan Spike is ministerial looking. It just so happens that famous psychic Andrew Jackson Davis in 1854 met Matthew and talked about how ministerial looking he was and that he couldn't believe that he was the author of Ethan Spike. Now, where Jackson writes about this is much later. The books that are published that have this little story are like 64 or something, or 68. But he may well have, had a loose tongue at this time, and that he may have been the source of the leak, see? Because both of them talk about him as being ministerial, and Matthew's making fun of it. But here's what he says. When I told him what a grave kinder of a ministerial-looking man Ethan Spike was, how he looked like a regular Jewish high priest in italics, a handling shoebread, that he was tall and kind of commanding in his reappearance. Now, there's two letters in here that shouldn't be in here, and that's reappearance. That's not a mistake. That's code. That means he's saying that if I'm not mistaken, he's saying that he is, or has been told in a reading, that he is the reincarnation of a high Jewish priest. Meanwhile, we have Candace Zellner saying you have rabbi all over you. And I kind of do look ministerial or look, like a high priest, or a Jewish priest or a rabbi. And that's what Candace said. So there's all these tie-ins. Now, here's another interesting tie-in. There's an article directly below Old Casual, and many times I found that Matthew would send in stuff in a package together, and the typesetter would just put them together because they came together in a stack. Or many times I think Matthew deliberately had his material published on the same page, on top or below or next to sign it, see? So posterity would know. I think he was keenly aware of posterity. He was hiding from his generation, but not from us, see? So I had to reincarnate. I was the only one that cared enough to put together the clues, including these, which I think is interesting. I'm amazed that nobody else thinks this is interesting. The stuff that people think is interesting on Facebook just leaves me cold, and this leaves them cold, see? So I just don't fit in at all, clearly. But directly below this article, The Spirits versus the Pulpit, Spiritualism, Reply of Mr. Woodman to Dr. Dwight. Now, Dr. Dwight was an old school guy, and I've got that in my book. He was somebody that was like pro-hanging and, very conservative. And he was very much against spiritualism, which was gaining ground at this time. And his basic argument was that God doesn't want us to know these things, Well, there's a spiritualist association in Portland at this time. Matthew is a member. He writes to his brother that he gives sermons for them. I think when they couldn't get another speaker in, one of their own members would come in and give a talk, and Matthew gave 4 of them. So we know he was involved from his correspondence with John Greenleaf Whittier. And there's more evidence, but I have told you that Matthew was the unsigning lyceum or speech reporter for the Portland Transcript. Mostly he reported the Mercantile Library Association. He reported people like Thoreau and Emerson and Samuel Clemens, and over many years, see, I may do a separate section on that. But this is written by Matthew for his group, the Portland Spiritual Association, about this debate. And it was the president of this organization, a Mr. Woodman, who was also owned a railroad there, which is probably why he was the president. And this article is about that encounter. I won't go into it in great depth. It says, before a crowded audience in Mechanics Hall, there was this debate between Woodman, the president of the association, and Dr. Dwight. It was actually a talk by Woodman. And here's what Matthew says. When he reports a speaker, all this is interconnected. I'm sorry, I have all these thoughts in my head about all this interconnections. When Matthew would report on a talk, he would always, or almost always, really every single time, I don't think there's any exceptions, he would always give a little review of the style and competence of the speaker himself, his own delivery style, see, and then he would launch into the talk. So there's no exception here. He says, before a crowded audience in Mechanics Hall on Sunday evening last, J.C. Woodman, Esquire, made his promised reply to Dr. Dwight's sermon on spiritualism. It was an able, ill-digested, learned, logical, egotistical, brusque discourse, at times very interesting, at times quite amusing. It was delivered extempore, Mr. Woodman not having had time to prepare a written discourse. He displayed much learning and great familiarity with the subject discussed, but if he had had time to give his matter a more compact form and had omitted certain extraneous passages, the reply would have been much more effective. Now, that's his own president and his own association. But what's going on here is that Dr. Woodman was very disorganized, apparently. But it so happens that after all of this was over, a booklet was published, as sometimes happen. This is called A Reply to William T. Dwight, D.D. on Spiritualism by Jabez Woodman, Esquire. In other words, the very talks that he gave were recorded in a book. And here, on this opening page, as was customary, is the letter in which the officers of this group requested that these talks be published. Remember that they were very disorganized talks, but this is a very well-organized presentation. And Matthew's name is in here. He's the second signer. James Furbish, M.F. Whittier. Down here is S.B. Beckett. Now, S.B. Beckett comes into my story because he ostensibly was the author of a travelogue having to do with going all around, traveling the railroads from Portland all around New England, see? Well, that's what Matthew had done in like 2 or 3 years earlier as Quails, whom historians believe was Ocean Dodge, but whom I have absolutely proven was Matthew Franklin Whittier. Matthew was also the author of that travelogue, and it's beautifully written, even though S.B. Beckett, who was also a Portland writer, has his name on it. So Matthew ghost wrote that for Beckett. I'm just going to get up real quick and go get a copy of that because it's right here on the shelf. Here we have Portland, White Mountains and Montreal Railroad Guide, Portland. And it's 1853. And it was entered, according to Act of Congress, in the year 1853 by S.B. Beckett. And again, it is beautifully written. I mean, I could just open it anywhere. But let us return to the Alpine House. Evening settles over the mountains. Every hour of the day they present a new aspect, a varying hue and shade puzzling to the beholder, but they never show to better effect than when, with the valleys and ravines below obscured by twilight, and he quotes, their lone summits cast the sunken daylight far through the aerial waste. I don't know whose poem that is. I'll look it up. If I can find it, I'll put it on the screen. This is typical of Matthew's prose, to insert poetry in the middle of it. This was definitely, I've proven it. This is definitely Matthew's work. So he was in the Portland Spiritualist Association with S.B. Beckett, and he ghost wrote for S.B. Beckett, see. So all of these things tie in, and the only way that these things, and the only way that these things tie in is because this is real. This is all real. You can't get this kind of internal tapestry that's so tight that anywhere you poke into it, you see evidence of everything else. unless it's real. This does not happen with a delusional system. This happens with reality that somebody has gotten into. So now, where were we? It's so hard to keep all this straight. So we have Old Casual. And by the way, he mentions down here in Mechanics Hall, this is not the Mechanics Hall that currently sits in Portland, because that was the new one. It was built a couple years later. This old Mechanics Hall was very near where Matthew and Abby last lived, in the Whittier's Hotel, or the American House Hotel, where she was dying, which I can see right out my window. If I look out my window and look at the skyline of Portland, there's a gap there right next to the big tall building that has the flashing temperature time sign, and that's where it was, right there. It's exactly where the Portland Public Library sits today, was where that hotel was. Mechanics Hall was right there in Market Square. And this is, I've come back to my past life. In a particular sense, I've cheated death, although I have amnesia. That's basically what it amounts to. I've found myself and I've come back, but I have amnesia. It's kind of a dirty trick. But anyway, in here, Old Casual mentions Mechanics Hall. Now, what does he say? Yeah. What I just read you says that he was a member of the church to Mechanic Hall, Haul. So it all ties in. Now, the point of all that was that Candace Zellner, the psychic medium, way back before I had any idea of Matthew Franklin Whittier, was already talking about me as a rabbi, meaning past life rabbi, which Matthew Franklin Whittier had also been told in a psychic reading, apparently. I think it's kind of interesting. It's not compelling in and of itself. Many of these things are not compelling in and of themselves, which is why I want people to read my books and get immersed in them and really get excited about them, because then you get the whole picture. When you just are just barely interested enough to watch 5 minutes of a video or to read the first 1/4 of a paper, and then you're done, you haven't gotten it. You don't understand the depth of this study when you do that. So all I can say is you have every right to do that, but you have no right to say that you have logically dismissed my case when you do that. Now, so we know from that Candace Zellner is probably accurate, but that's just the tip of the iceberg with her. So it so happens that in 1998, when I was just starting my documentary, In Another Life, Reincarnation in America, I had a website put up, and a fellow named Jeff Keane, whom you may have heard of, who turns out to be the reincarnation of a Civil War general, John B. Gordon, he called me or emailed me, I don't remember which, told me about his case, that Gordon had lived in Atlanta, had been the governor of Atlanta for a period of time, and he was interested in coming down. Jeff tells me, I'm still friends with him, he tells me that it was his idea to be videotaped in an interview in front of his past life tomb. I think that's probably correct. It is a world first, so far as I know. Nobody else has ever been videotaped in front of their own tomb. I did it myself. It's in my videos page, recently. So he came down, and I had conceived this idea, and I really hadn't thought it out terribly carefully. But my idea was I would get 3 psychics, and I would videotape with no editing in real time. I would videotape the readings, of him, and see what came up without telling the psychic anything ahead of time, and just see what came up. Well, I managed to do 2, and one of them, it was okay. I did a bad job on the videotaping, the audio and so on, and the other one I couldn't arrange, and there was a synchronicity involved with that. This was, I don't remember the name of the school, but it's in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I never could get hold of the head of it, who had been a student of Arthur Ford. I won't go any further down that road, but I kept getting hold of this one fellow named Steve Smith, who was a student at the school, and he and I would just kind of talk about technical things like audio and stuff that he was into. And finally, he asked me, well, what is it you want to talk to the head of the school about? And if I'd been thinking, I wouldn't have answered, but I did answer. I said, well, think that this fellow, Jeff Keane, may have been John B. Gordon in a past life, and I'd like to get a reading. I mean, I was naive as Matthew, and I still can be in this life, because normally you wouldn't do that. But anyway, he said, John B. Gordon, that was my great uncle. There were some interesting synchronicities around Jeff, and Jeff helped me find Matthew Franklin Whittier. If you've heard that story, I won't go into that. So Jeff Keane came down, and I videotaped him in front of his tombstone, and that segment is in my documentary, In Another Life. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting, a guy talking to you about his past life in front of, sitting on his past life body, basically. Whether the public thinks that's interesting or not, I don't know. What the public thinks is interesting is beyond me at this point. But I also arranged this psychic reading with Candace Zellner, with whom I had had a reading before, and I was pretty sure she was accurate. And I've got the videotape. It's on my website, but there's a section about Jeff Keane. Go to Cases in the navigation bar and then go to Jeff Keane, and you'll see a link to the video. However, if I can do it, I'll put the relevant segment in this one here. So what happened was that she gave her invocation. She knew nothing about him. I told her nothing about him at all. And she got his name and his birth date before they started. And then she gave her invocation to have only good spirits and no bad spirits could intervene, and for the highest good and that sort of thing. I don't remember exactly the wording. And immediately she launches into seeing him kind of crawling with a gun. I think she said behind enemy lines. And then she paused and kind of looked away and said, and boy, do I feel like it's France.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to ask you, have you ever had a psychic reading before?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, what I do is I say a prayer before I start, and then I say a prayer at the end. Now, at the beginning of it, I'm going to ask you your full birth name and birth date, and then we'll just kind of go from there. Okay? So
Fine.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
And your first name is Jeff, right?
Jeffrey.
Jeffrey. Okay. Let's start. Holy Spirit, I ask that my orbs and rings be activated. I ask that they clear and cleanse the energy field. I ask that my conscious mind, my will, body, and ego align to divine consciousness. I ask that all information I bring forth for Jeff be for his highest good and his soul's greatest growth. I ask that all master guides, teachers, angels, and archangels that are working with him at this time to come forth with information from the highest, purest clarity of light and love in my heart, open to give and receive all information. So be it. Amen. Okay. Jeffrey, right?
Jeffrey. Correct.
Jeffrey.
R-E-Y.
And your middle name?
Joseph.
Joesph. Mm-hmm. And your last name?
Keene. K-E-E-N-E.
Okay, and what's your birthday?
September 9th, 1947.
September. So that's 9/9/47. Okay.
At 5:45 p.m.
Okay. We'll take that one. You're right. All right. Now what I do is I say a prayer to make sure that what we get is clear and accurate information. So Holy Spirit, I just asked right now for us to see the last 3 lifetimes, if that's possible. And I ask that they come directly from the light. And I ask that all negative energies, entities, or cosmic jokers be blocked from this session, and that we only get truth. So be it. Amen. Immediately, Jeff, let me tell you something. I see you on a battlefield in a war, and I'm trying to see what war it is. Because I see you laying on the ground, you've got a gun in your hand, and there's others around you, so you're protecting the territory that you're in. Now, this is not, this is in another country. You're either in France or Germany, somewhere there, and boy, do I feel like it's France.
Now, I'm standing there behind the camera. Jeff had already given me this unpublished manuscript of his upcoming book, Not Yet. I think you can see it. This had not been published. I had read it. And on page 74, he talks about his daily meditations. And he says, he demurs, that he doesn't put a lot of stock into what he receives during his meditations until they're reinforced or validated in some way. Well, we'll see about that. Then he says, one recurring image was that of a soldier. The first time I came across him, he was crawling through leaves that were covering the ground. He carried a rifle with a very long tube on top. I took it to be a scope. It occurred to me that the leaves could be friend or foe. Friend in the fact that they could conceal, and foe because of the noise they make as one moves through them. Well, that's pretty strong, yeah? But check this out. Now he has another one. He says, a short time later, there were bright flashes. He's in a plane, okay? A short time later, there were bright flashes, possibly from bombs because of the low level we were flying at, or maybe from flak exploding near the plane. It may even have been from both sources. I remember thinking, I'm not part of the crew. They don't even know who I am or what I am. All they know is they are dropping me over Germany. I am going to France by way of Germany. He says, I get the impression that the crew had been warned not to talk about me or the drop zone, even among themselves. To do so may cause them to spend the remainder of the war in a cell. So the first thing out of Candace's mouth related not to the lifetime of John B. Gordon in the Civil War, but to this one, behind enemy lines in France, that he had already written about, and I'm standing there behind the camera having already read the manuscript, which she could not possibly have read because it was unpublished. Okay, so she's genuine, okay? And if you have watched psychic readings, mediums on YouTube, you'll know that they make hits all the time. I mean, this is a done deal. This is a done deal 1,000,000 times over. So the question is, why has not academia and the government and the officials and the people that tell us what's real, why has they not acknowledged this thing? Because what's happening is it's tearing society apart. It's destroying their credibility. No wonder people don't believe science, because they know darn well that, science tells us that, the mind doesn't exist outside the brain. And these psychic mediums are connecting people with their loved ones and giving validating information over and over and over. You could sit and watch these readings. There's so many of them on YouTube now. You could watch them all day. And you could sit there and tally up the things that the psychics say that are validating that they had no possible way of knowing, that are absolutely accurate. I could get on YouTube and find 20 of them in an hour, easily. So there's a serious disconnect in society. And again, it's no wonder that people don't trust science. They're destroying their credibility by stubbornly hanging on to materialism. It's killing them. So here we have this psychic reading that brought me and Abby back together. I already, as I described during my Valentine's Day video blog entry, I already had a feeling that Abby was trying to contact me. I'd had some contact with her. I had some inner experience of her presence off and on. And I knew that she was very special to Matthew, that they were soulmates. I felt that. I felt that she was my soulmate. The question was, did she want to continue a relationship? That's ratcheting it up to a whole nother level. Is this something that we honor, or is this something we pick up again? So that was the purpose of the reading. I told Candace nothing. I don't think she might not have remembered me or recognized who I was. And maybe, I don't know, maybe she did. I wrote to her and asked her if she would do a phone reading. And she wrote back and said she would not. And the reason was that I had an attached spirit, and that looking at me was, I'm going to shut off the heater here. Although I don't think you can really hear it anyway. She said you had an attached spirit, and looking at you psychically was like looking at an image in a fun house, all distorted. And I was very much taken aback. So I wrote to her again, and I didn't want to tell her anything at all, but I told her that I felt that my past life wife from, I don't know, I might have said 19th century, I don't remember, was trying to contact me, and that I wanted to try to contact her. And then she said, oh, okay, now I understand. The person that's around you is your soulmate. Or she didn't say soulmate until later. She said that's to herself, I think. She said, this is who's trying to contact you. And now I understand there's 2 lifetimes running parallel, because you're investigating this past life, and that's where the distortion comes in. So it's kind of interesting because what have I done to myself by moving to Portland and immersing myself in my past life writings to the point where, you know, emotionally and subconsciously, it's really kind of merged. I mean, in a particular sense, even though I don't really have Matthew's memories and I don't exactly have his personality because I don't have his life experience, all of my associations relate to the boy that was born in 1953, not the boy that was born in 1812, see? And yet it's the same higher mind, the same creativity, the same values, the same attitudes, you know. So in a particular sense, Matthew Franklin Whittier is talking to you right now about my past life. So, you know, what have I done to myself, you know, in terms of this distortion, this overlap? Well, I don't know. I feel pretty healthy overall. I'm very much socially isolated because nobody else believes it. But even if I develop a friendship, I can't talk to them about what's important to me. So it ends up becoming rather shallow, and eventually they kind of drift off or something happens. You know, I can't sustain a close friendship with anybody who disbelieves in things that are so fundamental to my life. You know, if somebody disbelieved in your wife, you can't be close friends with them, you know. Even if they disapprove of her, you can't really be. So with all that editorial stuff aside, I had this reading on March 10, 2010. And the very first thing she said, I believe she was supposed to call me at 2:00 in the afternoon. And she said, I almost called you an hour earlier because for the last hour, I've been bombarded with images. In other words, Abby was so eager to talk to me that she'd been just blasting poor Candace with all of these images, see, which is very sweet. So the reading proceeded. For the first half an hour or so, I didn't tell her anything. And the only thing I had sent her was the image of Matthew, the engraving that I first saw when I first learned about Matthew, which I'll put up on the screen, and the second page of a letter that Abby wrote to Matthew's sister. But Candace said she did not receive the letter. And I only have to believe her. She had a lot of trouble with her computer. She wasn't very computer savvy, and apparently maybe it was too big of an attachment, you know, or something, because it was a big file. I might have sent the full high-res file that was sent to me by Houghton Library. I don't know. Anyway, I believe her that she didn't get that. So all she had was this unattributed engraving of Matthew Franklin Whittier with no name, nothing to go on. And she starts out, I'm getting a little more comfortable in front of the camera, which means these are going to be a little more colloquial and sloppy. And I'll be editing out fewer of these slips and asides and false starts and things. But, you know, it's kind of homey, fireside chats and all of that. So this was not recorded, but I took notes in real time. So what I'm reading here is not the way that she talked, it's my notes. So the first paragraph I have is nobility, stature, status, wife not right, religion, family against, loved her dearly, family or families feuded, rejected him, quote, you can come, but she can't, dash, because of religion or status. Now, this is partly right and partly wrong. And I think what happened is these psychics and mediums are working with a team on the other side. And this team acts as an intermediary, and they hit the medium with images. And then a really practiced medium, which basically Candace is a psychic who is functioning as a medium. She's not like a really practiced medium, or she wasn't at the time, I don't think. And it takes time to learn those symbols and have the symbols kind of agreed on, you know, so that when the team gives them a certain symbol from their own life, they know what that signifies. So she had seen Matthew's image, and he's very noble looking. I think you'll agree. And so she just made the assumption when she was getting this information about nobility, stature, and status, she apparently assumed that was Matthew. And you'll see why she's kind of going on that intellectual assumption. Because he was noble, but he had no stature or status. He was a Quaker farm boy. He was a poor farm boy, see? Whereas Abby was the daughter of a marquis. She actually was of royal descent, see? So, in other words, the team was telling them that Abby was, you know, highborn, but she was attaching it to Matthew because that was the image she had seen. That's my guess. The wife was not the right religion. She was Catholic. Matthew's family was Quaker, and the family does not appear to have approved of her. Matthew loved her dearly, definitely. The family or families feuded and rejected him. Yes, I can definitely prove that Abby's father, the Marquis, Joseph Poyen, rejected Matthew as a suitor for Abby on class basis. But then she says, you can come, but she can't. So what does that mean? That means Matthew, this is interesting because Matthew had long left the Whittier family and he'd been disowned as a Quaker. He'd gone on to make a career for himself in New York City. But he was still, and he was basically, I think, being shunned by the Whittier family. That's never spoken of in the Whittier legacy, and Quakers supposedly didn't shun, but he was being shunned. And Matthew complained about it over the years, not understanding what was going on. Why wouldn't his brother write to him? Why wouldn't his brother come to see him? Finally, he figured it out. So you can come, but she can't because of religion or status. So she was dead on, but she had it backwards in terms of Matthew and Abby. Then she says, I could be Matthew, confirmed, she's certain. Now, keep in mind the other hits she's made and the hits that I'm going to tell you about. This woman is genuine psychic. She's telling me it's confirmed, she's certain that I'm Matthew Franklin Whittier reincarnated. This has its own evidential weight, which I don't think anybody ever pays any attention to because I don't emphasize it. Nobody pays any attention to anything I say anyway. But this is validation with a certain weight in its own right. Now, I say Candace's perception, like a funhouse mirror, distorted because of both lives running parallel, more like a parallel universe overlaid, warped in time. So she apparently made a comment about it in the reading at the beginning. And then I asked if Abby was contacting me now. She says off and on, more than in my notes, more about parallel life overlapping, time warping in on itself, etc. Then she says, I was Matthew, confirmed. Now, at what point in the reading did I mention the name Matthew? That's a question in my notes. I don't think I did, but I can't be certain of it. I think when I write down I could be Matthew, that's not actually what she said. It's the way I'm interpreting it. But I'll leave it out there that I may have mentioned his first name. I don't know. So she says, I don't think she did. I think what she said was, you are the person you're thinking you were, or something like that. I don't think she had Matthew's name. So I was Matthew, confirmed, was meant to be, parentheses, marriage, was some trouble in the marriage, mostly caused by influences and pressures from the outside, still loved each other. I don't have any fear of crossing over, Abby says. Her energy gets low because of how she died, weak, voice hardly audible, laying on rail bed with thin mattress at home. Then one child died in fire, ? Her death of disease. Tuberculosis? Well, let's break this one down. Was meant to be is pretty obvious if you look at the history of it. Abby knew, apparently, that they were going to be married from quite young, was being psychic herself, or at least she believed that. Was trouble in the marriage mostly caused by influences and pressures from outside, still loved each other. That was jealousy. I found that referred to metaphorically in a great number of Matthew's stories, both serious and humorous. And the jealousy situation, very briefly, as I can figure it out, aside from both of them were jealous, but jealous types. And Matthew was a born comedian, and he liked to try out his material on people. And the girls would gather around, but they were more attracted to him than his humor. He didn't realize it, being rather naive. Abby could see it, and it made her very nervous, that Matthew was joking with these ladies, see? And he would kind of brush it off, say, well, I don't have any interest in them. They're just interested in my humor and everything. And she could see it was quite otherwise. So eventually it flipped her out to the point where the only thing she knew to do was to get back at him, to give him a taste of his own medicine. So she would make him jealous, not having any serious intentions whatsoever. But she would make him jealous to bring him around and realize how it felt. And it had the opposite effect, obviously, because Matthew had what I would call a glass jaw where jealousy was concerned. See? So that was the basis of those troubles that she's referring to. But all of that I can confirm in the various stories. There's one child they had two children. One of them we know died of scarlet fever, but the other one, who died 2 weeks before Abby did, we don't have any way of knowing how she died. It's possible if Abby was very sick, and she did have tuberculosis, so Candace was correct about that. If she was very ill of tuberculosis, they may have taken their 8-month-old daughter and given her into the care of some other couple. And it was not at all uncommon for children and adults to die by fire because they didn't have fire retardant clothing, and they were using candles and fireplaces and so on. And somebody would catch fire on a candle or a fireplace and they couldn't put them out. That happened to Longfellow's wife, how Longfellow's wife, Fanny, I believe, died. So it was not uncommon. That could have happened. Abby may have felt so responsible and so guilty that she just let herself go, which is what I think happened. And the reason I think that happened is because in the star-signed reviews for the New York Tribune, which were written by Matthew and not by Margaret Fuller. You see how all this evidence is hidden because of these mistaken attributions. He briefly mentions a story about an American Indian chief in France whose wife let herself die after like the 4th or 5th child of theirs died. And the only reason, it's out of context, and the only reason that Matthew would have included that in his article is if it represented what had happened to Abby. So therefore, I think that that's correct, that that's the way that Abby died. All of these things interconnect. Now, when she says her energy gets low because of how she died, the psychic mediums very often tell you that people on the other side will make them feel physically the way that the person felt when they died. So this is typical mediumship of Abby dying of tuberculosis. Now, Matthew was not there when she died. He apparently sent her home to her family home, which was a big deal because her father apparently had said, I won't help you unless you leave Matthew, So finally, in a desperate attempt to save Abby's life and to motivate her to eat and to live, he apparently sent her home, thinking that her mother could do what he couldn't. And she died there a few days later, and I can confirm that in a letter from Abby's sister to Matthew's sister. It also shows up in Annabel Lee. That exact scenario shows up in Annabel Lee, which was an autobiographical poem written by Matthew Franklin Whittier about Abby's death, never published during Poe's lifetime, probably because he didn't dare publish it because Matthew had threatened to expose him if he ever did. And that idiosyncratic detail shows up in that poem. Moving along here, I asked why she, meaning Abby, had stopped contacting me. Because of Earth conditions, veil is getting thinner, but sometimes are better than others. In other words, I was thinking, maybe Abby didn't want to be with me because I didn't feel her presence anymore. It says, no, it's off and on because of Earth conditions. And then there's a section where I asked who my first researcher was, and she thought about that. Then she goes on. Now, I don't know at what point I told Candace who I thought Matthew was, but I don't think it was yet. I've just said, how does my researcher figure into this, or something that didn't betray who I thought I had been. So that I don't need to go into. Then she says, the books we were studying were based on reincarnation. Black market books. Had to hide them. Abby putting under her dress if someone approached. Like-mindedness between us in complete agreement. Abby talks poetically. Her education came after her schooling, largely from Matthew, reading books together. We were ahead of our time. Now, this is a mixture of mistakes and accurate information. And again, I think that the mediums are given images and impressions, and then they have to interpret them. Well, she's still interpreting backwards in terms of who was the one of upper class. See, she's still got that in her mind. But the books we were studying were metaphysics. They were metaphysical books, and I can prove this, that Abby knew metaphysics, high metaphysics, and that she was trying to teach him. As far as reincarnation is concerned, she probably believed in it. He did not. He did not accept reincarnation until I think he became open-minded around 1850. I have an unsigned little essay about pre-existence of the soul that was written by Matthew, I'm pretty sure, in the Portland transcript. And then we have the references in 1857 I've just showed you. But when she was teaching him early on, he did not accept reincarnation. They did probably have to hide them. About Abby putting book under her dress if someone approached, that means they're outside. And there's several indications that Abby did love to spend time outdoors in nature and that she taught Matthew partly outdoors. If you want to know what their mentoring relationship was like, you only have to go to Elizabeth Barrett Browning's 1844 compilation poems. The two poems, Lady Geraldine's Courtship and Wine of Cyprus, are both written by Matthew Franklin Whittier in his accustomed meter, and they both describe that tutoring relationship, outdoors and indoors. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning modified it to fit her own life and her own mentoring relationship with Hugh Stuart Boyd. It was not. It was Matthew's poetry that she plagiarized. So it'll give you a very good idea. Both poems are about the same thing. Okay? It just so happens that Lady Geraldine's Courtship emphasizes Abby's high-born origins. See? Her father was actually higher in rank than the father in Lady Geraldine's Courtship. I believe that young woman in England was supposed to have been the father of an earl, but Abby was the father of a marquis. They did read these books together, but it was Abby who taught Matthew. See, and she did. She gave him a full liberal education in lieu of him being able to attend college, which he was never able to do. So Abby stepped in as a young girl and started tutoring him. A lot of it was by mail, but nonetheless, she gave him a good education. So apparently, Candace got the impression of one of them teaching the other, one of them giving the other an education. But because she was already predisposed to think of Matthew as the one from nobility, she reversed it. It's not really a mistake, except the kind of mistakes that mediums make all the time. It says, both were working on it, but it went wrong, and we were shunned. A court scene like a witch trial, not physical punishment, but severe verbal lawyers. Now, this is a strange thing to say. This is not a cold reading, because in a cold reading, you don't get specific like that. You understand? You talk about, I feel a little shy around strangers, and, I went to a big city, and, you don't come out with something weird like this. And something similar to that came up in another psychic reading. So I was able to track this down. I'm not going to drag it all out here because it would take me all day to do it. It was very deeply buried, but I found evidence that they were in fact shunned. And I found evidence that Abby, around age 12, must have gone through a period of being completely shunned by the whole society, with the exception of, I think, her oldest sister and Matthew. These poems were plagiarized and claimed by Albert Pike. They were not written by Albert Pike. They're something he stole out of her workbook when she was his student in a class in Newburyport in 1830. See, this was Abby, who had apparently, based on one of her stories, if it's autobiographical, what happened is two sisters tricked her into giving a palm reading to one of the girls, because one of the girls was getting interested in a boy who wasn't going to be good for her, and the sister wanted Abby to give her a palm reading that told her to stay away from the boy. See, that was their pretense. Really speaking, they were setting her up, I think. So Abby apparently went ahead, even though she'd been told by her mother, never do this with any of the local girls, So she'd been warned. So she did it out of compassion because she was begged, please help my sister, And then they turned her in. They tattled on her. And I know this also because right about this time, 1828, in the New England Galaxy, where Matthew was contributing, he wrote a series of 3 stories about the Slander Club. And he parodies and ridicules the people in Haverhill who are shunning Abby and gossiping about her. And that was done to encourage her, to back her up. See, and I think it meant the world to her. They were very funny, and it's very clearly, knowing how these things were all happening around this same time, it must have been a tremendous comfort to her. So that is correct. They were shunned. I have more evidence that they were shunned from the Monitor, the Salisbury Monitor, which was Matthew Franklin Whittier's short-lived, self-published newspaper when they were living in Amesbury. After they had written pro-abolition letters to the editor in Dover, New Hampshire, where they had eloped to, they were driven out of Dover, New Hampshire, as I gather. They went back to Amesbury, where his family was living, and probably lived in poor housing connected with the mill workers. And they were shunned there because it shows up in the Monitor. And I know that not because I can find the Monitor, but because it was reprinted in other papers. The northern paper sympathizes, the southern paper blames him, see? But what was happening was that girls were coming, girls meaning probably the mill workers, were coming at night and throwing rocks at the windows. But see, if they were throwing rocks at the windows, they were also throwing rocks through the windows and screaming. And Abby was terrified that she had a baby, and she was terrified that they were going to set the place on fire. See, so they were persecuting her because of her interest in the occult, but they were also persecuting both of them because of their anti-slavery work, which they were putting in the newspaper. And I think what happened from past life memory and extrapolation is that they were printing articles urging the mills to shorten the hours, because the girls were probably working like 12 hours or something, and they were doing that. And the mill workers incited the girls to attack Matthew and Abby personally. See, I think that's what was going on. Political, in other words, behind it, money. I can prove that to a point. I have evidence, but I can't nail it. And then she says, died of tuberculosis, was swift, like a plague. And this is kind of contradictory because tuberculosis normally isn't swift, but I mean, here's the truth. She'd had it for some time. She'd recovered from it to a certain point. But then when their daughter died, tragically, I think, that she just let go of the will to live. It was wintertime. They were in a drafty hotel room, if my memory serves. And she was sick anyway, and she just stopped eating and let herself go. So that was swift. And it was tuberculosis. And it says, I was with her and held her hand. She was the comforting one. She stayed in spirit, visited. Matthew believed it while it was happening, but sobbed afterwards and perhaps questioned whether he was going mad. This is way on target, more than what you'd think just from reading it, because he was with her up until the last several days when he sent her home. She would have been the comforting one because she was deeply spiritual and had a deeper faith in life after death than he did. And then she stayed in spirit and visited, and so on. There's many poems that Matthew wrote about spirit visitations, and I'm going to talk about one today. So we know that, but I also know that he was skeptical. When she first started trying to teach him about these things, the afterlife and spiritual communication and so on, he was so skeptical that he started making fun of some of it. Gradually, she brought him around. But toward the end, I mean, after she died, he couldn't sustain his faith because it was intellectual, see? And this is what The Raven is about. That's precisely what he was writing about when he wrote The Raven, was this faith crisis, this struggle to believe. And the books that he says that he was studying at the beginning of The Raven were actual books that he actually was studying that Matthew and Abby had read together as described by Candace. There's a depth to this thing that nobody has any idea because they'll only watch the first 5 minutes of a video or read the first 5 paragraphs of a paper. They don't understand the depth of the study. Questioned whether he was going mad. Well, he was. He did apparently go briefly insane from grief and from the terrible inner conflict of believing or not believing. Now, early on, when I found Abby's tombstone, it has an inscription, and it says, this is from memory, I wasn't prepared for this, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord." And when I saw that, it hit me. I remembered, as Matthew, struggling over and over with what that meant. And, how could they be blessed if they're dead? The irony of the thing. And I struggled and struggled and struggled back and forth in madness, the same madness that you see reflected in the raven. But Matthew had often written in code, and the code that he used sometimes was not to give the message in the quote. The message is in the context of the quote. You have to look up the quote and you have to see the whole context, and that's what it means. I don't know if other people used that technique or not, but Matthew used it, and Abby used it when she requested that epitaph, and he didn't get it, apparently, based on my feelings. That comes from Revelations, and I don't have it in front of me. Maybe I can put it up on the screen. But the gist of it is that she says that her works will be remembered. She will be remembered, and her works will be remembered in the future because she was psychic and she had foresight and she could see it. Well, she's absolutely correct. A Christmas Carol went around the world and influenced millions. And now, if I have anything to say about it, she is going to be credited for the future with the authorship of the most important elements of that story. So she saw correctly, even though this girl is so obscure that you can barely even find her birth date. You can find her name, not her correct middle name, and you can find when she died and when she was married, and that's it. Basically, you can't find anything on this girl, but she knew, see. Then she says, Abby couldn't contact me until I was past 46. I may pass at age 60 or perhaps 61. She will be the one meeting me on the other side. Important to get the work done before then. This is the time when we can get the information out. Now, Candace could have understood that I was trying to get a message out. I don't think that was too much of a secret. I found Abby later than 46, but what had happened was that I had gotten into an unfortunate, lengthy relationship, and she had to wait until that relationship played out before she could contact me. And I am obviously older than 61. I'm now 67, but I have had some ongoing health problems. And the biggest thing that happened around age 60 or 61 was that I started taking care of my mother. And I was the sole caregiver for her up until her passing in, 2018, January 2018. And it was hugely stressful. Anybody who has been the sole caretaker of anyone who's dying, she had dementia. Her vision was going. She had dementia. She required absolute round-the-clock care. And I did this. There was one lady that would come in and give her a bath. That was for a certain period of that time. And then right at the end, the last 2-3 weeks or so, I got hospice in. Other than that, I was it. And I had Abby helping me and advising me. But it was hugely stressful. And I was working on my first book at the same time. So I put in like 16-hour days, over and over and over and over and over. And here I am 60. So I could very easily have passed during that time. And Candace probably saw the stress that was coming up for me. I had no way of knowing it in 2010. So that's probably what she's talking about. But the work, I haven't gotten it done, So basically, I have to stick around until I get this work done. And getting it done means that people recognize the truth of what I've discovered. And there's enough interest and enough funding to where I can put together a little museum, hopefully, or at the very least, for it to be preserved by some major institution like Houghton Library or something like that where it can be found. But I really would prefer the museum. Then she says, quote, 36. At first I thought, and I'm speaking of myself, at first I thought 36 years old, but then maybe 1836 as death time. Well, no, 1836 was when they were married. So, I mean, Abby's waxing a little romantic. Then, speaking of Matthew, Candace says, as a result of Abby's death, his heart wasn't in it after that. He didn't show his emotion, depression. Abby was his soulmate. They had overcome great obstacles to be together. Her death was unexpected. He never thought he'd live so long without her, became withdrawn, eccentric. Well, I can definitely prove the depression and the lifelong grief. I can prove that he became withdrawn and eccentric many times over in poetry and various other things, which I won't make this longer than it has to be by proving that, but just take my word for it. He didn't show his emotion. This is absolutely typical of Matthew Franklin Whittier's personality, that he hid his true feelings, even from quite young. And that's because he went through an abusive childhood. See, the Whittier family was very emotionally dysfunctional. And so he learned to hide his feelings and he was very sensitive, but he learned, his father apparently was in the business of toughening his boys and making them tough. And he was a very sensitive, both of the boys were sensitive, poetic types. So what happened, and I have a master's in counseling, so I have some authority to speculate on this. They took the two opposite paths of coping with this situation in the family, that the father was sadistic and was trying to toughen them. John Greenleaf Whittier checked out into La La Land, and he was so brilliant as a poet that he turned it into a career. And he is celebrated as the poet that kind of romanticizes New England life, but it's part of his neurosis. In part. Doesn't mean he's not brilliant. He's a wonderfully talented poet. But don't look for reality in those poems because he checked out, So that's the way that John Greenleaf handled it. Matthew Franklin Whittier, as the black sheep of the family, took the opposite approach. And I studied this in family theory. The black sheep is the one who voices all the dysfunction. He's the one who challenges the family's secrets. Or secret, see, whatever it is, the toxicity in the family. He's the one that openly challenges the family toxicity by rebelling. So Matthew was a muckraker. Matthew was the one who challenged hypocrisy anywhere he found it, see? And that's where that came from, because he took the opposite tack, see? Now, something about Matthew estranged from his own lineage, not spoken about. Candace felt it was on the East Coast, New York, Washington, Virginia. Abby wanted Candace to address her as Abigail, formal, showed wearing pearls. Okay, let's take this one at a time. Definitely Matthew was estranged from his own lineage. I told you that Whittier family shunned him when he married Abby outside the Quaker faith, and the Quakers disowned him. And that distance continued, and he remained estranged from his brother for many years. So she was spot on about that. And not spoken about, absolutely. You get into the Whittier legacy, you won't find a thing about this. You have to go outside the Whittier legacy to a reporter named Charles O. Stickney to find out that they were even estranged. All you'll find out is Matthew painted as a bad guy, the black sheep of the Whittier family. That's all you'll find in there. Or he's marginalized or ridiculed, or, they totally don't get it. And of course, Haverhill, Massachusetts is in fact on the East Coast, although she didn't name the right state. He spent a great deal of time in New York City, which I didn't know at the time that this reading was given. So she may have been picking up on that. I had no idea that he'd lived for years and years in New York City. Now, about Abby wanting to be formal and wanting to be addressed as Abigail and showed wearing pearls. Well, the portrait I have of her shows her wearing a brooch with a very large pearl in it. As far as wearing pearls, I don't know. And as far as wanting Candace to address her formally, I don't know. I don't know what that was about. Abby asked about the 5 children. I corrected Candace, were only 2, then remembered that Matthew had 5 total. Abby had found me, but can't locate them, wanted very much to know what became of them. Well, this is strange because I have in my mind that people in the astral world can just find anybody they want to. That may or may not be true. I don't know. I don't have much of a sense of what happened to those children. I did find a poem that was written about their son, that was reworked and published by Elizabeth Barrett Browning in that 1844 compilation, but also like 4 years earlier in Finden's magazine, Finden's Illustrated, I think. And I've gone into that. I will go into that in a paper about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's plagiarism of Matthew's work, which is also going to be published sometime later this year in Real Paranormal Magazine UK. So I won't go into that now. There's nothing about the second child that I can find, except that one reference in the Star Sign article with the metaphorical story about the Indian chief in France who's, lost a child, and his wife decided to just die, and he supported her. So I don't really have a sense of what happened to these children or any memory of it, except that I think that the boy was precocious. He was an old soul, and that Matthew was very proud of him as such. And it was so painful that he completely emotionally blocked out everything. So if I had a past life regression, it might all come out and it might be very messy. Abby cries, remembers sitting on a swing for 2 under a tree by a river, romantic. Matthew reading black market book to her. Black market books hard to get. Metaphysical, drew them together. Both knew they would come together again. Both understood reincarnation. Well, this is interesting because in the early period, when they would have been sitting on a swing together under a river by a tree, well, Abby's house in Rocks Village, East Haverhill, Massachusetts, overlooked the Merrimack River, which is a very large, beautiful river. And they very easily could have sat in a swing. I think I know exactly where it is based on a poem that was plagiarized by Albert Pike, which talks about them sitting together looking over the river, see? And she talks about a bend in the river, and there is a bend there. I've been at that spot. You can't see the river very well now because of trees, but if the trees were not there at the time, they would have had a beautiful view of the river and that bend in it. So there's clues that confirm this, but, and she would have probably been, they would have been reading black market books to each other. She could afford these things because her family had money, see? And they would have studied metaphysics, but Matthew did not accept reincarnation at this time. He did not accept astrology. He did not accept prescient dreams because he poked fun of them when he wrote and edited for the New York Constellation in 1830, 1829, 1830, 1831, 32. He made fun of these things. So obviously he didn't accept them yet. But later on, he did, apparently, and not reincarnation, but certainly many of the other metaphysical things she taught him, he did start to accept. I think she taught him the teachings of Hermes and possibly alchemy and German mysticism. It's hard to say, but Eastern metaphysics, I know that she studied. So it's almost like Candace is condensing several different periods. Now I have in brackets, when Candace had said East Coast and guessed about location, I told her New England. Now I told her Matthew's identity. And this portion of the reading is after I was disclosing the history. I don't know when I added this note, but it was fairly early. So this is the point at which she knew who Matthew was. And then I'll go ahead and continue it. I don't consider this to have nearly as much validity as the portion where she didn't know who she was reading about. And the reason is that I think that this psychic and possibly all psychics, they're working off of information that they get from their team on the other side by way of images. But when you ask them questions, they don't stop and wait for those images. They go on with their own intuition, which I don't think is nearly as accurate as the information they're getting from the other side. However, she says, my ideas about Edgar Allan Poe are correct, exactly correct, or something to that extent, about my thinking that he wanted to be friends and him recruiting me as a political ghostwriter. It would take a lot of research to uncover, repeated, may find in Edgar Cayce readings. Now, I had no idea or thought that Matthew had been the original author of The Raven at this point, but I had, under hypnosis a couple years earlier, seemingly remembered Matthew meeting with Edgar Allan Poe on the front porch, a wide front porch, wide both ways, went all the way to the ends of the house and wide, unfinished wood, and they sat and they smoked pot in pipes, and they were kind of feeling each other out and supposedly and sharing. I guess they were just, sharing, comparing notes as authors. And then I got this idea that Poe was broaching the possibility of Matthew ghostwriting for somebody that he knew on political subjects. I have no evidence to back that up. It seems very unlikely, although it's conceivable, especially if Poe didn't know Matthew's politics yet at that point. It's possible, because Poe was certainly lukewarm on slavery, if not pro-slavery, and Matthew was very much against slavery. But I didn't even think about that Matthew could have been the author of The Raven. That came much later. But Candace is saying it's correct. And she's saying that it would take a lot of research, which I have. In fact, basically, I've proven that Matthew was the real author of The Raven, therefore, and that Poe would have to have had a physical copy of it, and that would have happened in the first half of 1842. Abby died in 1841 in March. So by proving that Matthew was the original author of The Raven and that Poe would have to have had a physical copy, I've proven that the meeting was accurate. Now, as far as the Edgar Cayce readings is concerned, I paid my dime and got access to those readings, which are searchable. I found nothing connected with Poe that was helpful at all, if anything. But I did find a description of John Greenleaf Whittier, which is not particularly flattering, and which coincides precisely with the way that I seem to remember their relationship. See, nobody else portrays John Greenleaf Whittier that way, but in the Edgar Cayce readings, it does. Now, I think the spirits that were working with her were trying to get her that information so that I would get in there and find this very helpful little clue, because it's one of the few places where you can prove that, at least somebody perceived John Greenleaf Whittier very differently. Let's see. Let's go on with this. Plague did come from ship, hence Matthew's guilt. Women shunned Abby as well. Many of them gossiped behind her back, got the devil. Well, I don't know if tuberculosis came from a ship. It may have. Apparently, Abby got it in her charitable work. I hesitate to put it that way, but she would go poor visiting. And I think that she tended one of Matthew's in-laws in Dover, New Hampshire, who died of probably consumption, who was put in the pest house. Pest house was not a hospital. It was a place where people were put to die away from everybody else. And I think this woman had been very, very kind and welcoming to Abby when they eloped to Dover, New Hampshire. Sarah Hacker Jones Whittier was her name. She was the second wife of Matthew's cousin, Moses Whittier. And I think she was very kind to Abby as a kind of a Whittier in-law herself, and that when she was in the pest house, Abby could not leave her to die by herself in there. Even, I think they knew that consumption was contagious, or could be, but she risked her life to do that and died from it. Matthew, I have long felt that Matthew was guilty. I did find evidence for that Matthew did feel terrible guilt, as many people do. They beat themselves up over and over about something they did wrong, or something they could have said, or something they could have done. Matthew was no exception. That's not particularly evidential because it's so universal. But about this women gossiping behind her back got the devil. In the Salisbury Monitor, there's this little section where Matthew just says very sarcastically that these girls who are throwing rocks at the windows, their mamas should tie their little thumbs together, and then the editors respond to that. One of them from the South very sarcastically that he must be a horrible person, for these girls to be throwing rocks through the windows. He knows it's through the windows and not at the windows. And he knows it's their house and not just generally around the neighborhood. See, the editor knew that. So this was absolutely on target. And she had no reason to believe that Abby was shunned, And then, let's see. The figurine that I saw was brought back to her mother, cherished by her mother and by Abby. Gave to her mother. Looking at it, I remembered how much Abby loved it. Rare treasure. This goes to, and I don't want to get into this too far because this would take an entry in itself. My first researcher wrote me, do you remember anything about Abby's funeral? And I was sitting there writing this email saying, no, I don't remember anything. And as I did that, I started remembering and I just started typing. And what I remembered was the reception. One of the things I remembered was in the reception, which I think I know where that took place. It's a house not very far from where Abby was buried. It's called the Peasley Garrison House. I've been to it. I couldn't get in it because nobody was home. I knocked on the door. I remembered you go in the front door, you go to the right. There's a parlor, large parlor area to the right, which there is. And I sat on a typical sofa for that era, which was correct. And I had brought a bunch of friends who didn't really know Abby, see? And the reason I'd done that, I've extrapolated that this was not the original funeral. I was not invited to or did not attend the original funeral because of this enmity between Matthew and Abby's father. So her mother apparently liked Matthew and arranged a separate funeral some 2-3 months later. And so Matthew, to have some people with, brought these friends, and they didn't know Abby, and they were just partying and laughing and joking. See, they couldn't take it seriously. So they were just acting as their usual selves, and Matthew was just dying inside. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. It was all he could do to bite his lip and not explode. So in front of him, there was a brass figurine of a dancer pirouetting, and it was about that high, and it was under a bell jar. And what Matthew did, and I later found out that Abby danced. See, I didn't know at that time that Abby talks in her poetry about dancing. He stared at that figurine like a meditation with all his might as a way to get through that experience without bolting. And the reason he didn't get up and leave is because it would have hurt Abby's mother's feelings, Sally's feelings. And he respected Sally. And she had gone to the trouble of arranging this whole thing, probably to some expense. And he would not hurt her by doing that. But it was all he could do to stay. So he just made himself look at this figurine, and it was burned into my mind, see? Well, my researcher, I believe, has talked with the current owner of the Peasley Garrison House. They have not heard of anything like that. There is a historical account of the Peasley Garrison House that it had a great many curious artifacts, and that one of the people who inherited it was wealthy and kind of spruced it up inside. But I put out feelers, to try to get in touch with these people and to try to keep an eye out for a figurine like that. If I find that figurine, I've got basically what it looks like in my book, which was published, 2011, 2012. If that's ever found, this is a smoking gun that's like, 500 feet tall, but it hasn't been found yet. I'm hoping someday it will be, because it was a very strong impression that I got. Now, that's what I was asking her about that figurine. Was brought back to her mother, cherished by her mother. I have no idea why. See, this is why I don't really consider Candace's readings to be nearly as accurate at the point where I'm asking her questions. And if you have a reading like this, don't ask questions. Just let them talk, you know. Abby and Matthew would go in nature to talk safely where we could be ourselves. Matthew would put blossoms in her hair, also earlier lifetimes together in the 1400s. Abby flipping pages, parentheses of lifetimes we had been together. Well, definitely I have them out in nature. Just read Wine of Cyprus. You'll get the idea, or Lady Geraldine's Courtship. There's other poems. There's another poem of Matthew taking Abby for a nighttime walk. There's another poem about them being under the stars and looking at the stars. This is kind of generic stuff. There's also one about, there's some reference to putting blossoms in her hair. So, but again, these are kind of generic, but they're all absolutely on target. And there's nothing that isn't accurate. The earlier lifetimes, of course, I have no way of showing, but this is typical for soulmates, that they've spent many lifetimes together. Now, here's something I asked her. Matthew did influence the writing of A Christmas Carol. Candace didn't know what it was until I told her the story of Scrooge. Dickens read between the lines, didn't have it complete. That's a strange way of putting it. Abby corrected her that it was signed by Matthew, but the proof was burned in a fire. Okay, that Dickens didn't have it complete and that he read between the lines means I would take that to mean that he didn't really understand it and that he modified it, which is correct. That it was signed by Matthew, but that the proof was burned in a fire. Later, much later, I found out that Matthew's flat in Portland in, I believe it was 1852, was burned. And it appears to have been arson in retaliation for Matthew having written anti-military work in the Boston Carpetbag. He did a caricature of a military hero called Ensign Jehiel Stebbings, which was attributed by the editor, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, to Benjamin Drew, who worked with him on the Post. That's not correct. It was Matthew's character. And somebody found out, and apparently Matthew was out of town at this time. And I get that from the Carpetbag. There is an instance where Matthew was permitted to write as one of Shillaber's characters, the little boy, the nephew of Ike, his name was, the nephew of Mrs. Partington, whom she was raising. He was a hellion, and Matthew writes a story about Ike in the country and signs it with his accustomed star or asterisk, the same signature he used when he wrote for the New York Tribune, those pieces being falsely attributed to Margaret Fuller. You see how complex this thing is and how interwoven. I feel, as I read that article, that Matthew himself had fled to the country during this period, because this is just about the period during which his flat was torched. It was over the Sawyer grocery. It was on the corner of Pearl and Congress Streets, which I've shown a picture of that. The Brown Library cannot tell me which corner it was on. They found Sawyer. He later apparently launched a confectionery company, but they don't know where his grocery store was. I've researched these things as far as I can take them. But she is saying that Matthew did influence the writing of A Christmas Carol, because that's the way I put it when that came to me in 2006, and I put it in my blog. I have in my blog the impression that Matthew had something to do with the writing of A Christmas Carol. So that was 2006. This reading is 2010, so I specifically asked her about it, and she confirmed it. Whether it was really in that flat, whether it was burned when the flat was burned in 1852, we don't know. And then at the end, I add a little memory in 6:410 about Candace being bombarded with images. And that's it. That's my notes from that reading. From then on, I started really connecting with Abby in earnest and learning how to communicate with her. But for quite a while, I made a horrible mistake. And that was that in the main memory network online, I found a daguerreotype of a girl who I got a past life impression from. It was a very clear impression, and I won't put it up here because our anniversary's coming up, but it looks a lot like Abby, but it was from 1850. And the memory I had was I'm with this girl at a small space, like a bathroom, but maybe not a bathroom because they might not have had a bathroom in 1850. I don't know, but it was in a small room and we were both getting dressed. We lived together, obviously, and it was very casual, you know. And so I assumed that had to be Abby, and it wasn't. And this is where I sent that picture to an expert. I know I'm really going over on time. I don't care. I sent that daguerreotype to an expert. And I found out, first of all, researching it, that daguerreotypes were not available in the United States until 1840 at the very earliest. And there's very few remaining still from 1841 when they were first available. So it's very unlikely there's a daguerreotype of Abby at all. But then he says the hairstyle definitely identifies this as 1850s. And I fought him. This was one of the instances where I tried to put the square peg into the round hole, and I wouldn't agree, and I kept looking for examples, online, and I finally had to concede it. This is the puffed wings, where they would put paper inside, and their hair would come way out to the side, and it was clearly 1850s. So, but then I found evidence in Ethan Spike that Matthew had a live-in relationship for about a month with a girl that he was very attracted to, but who didn't want to get married. And he didn't realize that she was against marriage. And he said that he refused to have an ongoing affair. He said that, it was either be celibate or have an ongoing live-in affair without getting married. And he refused to do either one. So he ended it. That's what Ethan Spike says in so many words. And it perfectly fits this girl. So I think that's what it is. She's unidentified. We don't know. But round about that time, and I don't remember exactly which came first, I think this is a little later, I had a visitation dream from Abby. I've talked about this some in the February 14th Valentine's Day entry. We were in something like the Holland Tunnel in a car. We had a long conversation, and then, or like 5-minute conversation anyway, which I don't remember. And then I looked at her and I became semi-lucid, like I knew enough to question what was going on. And I said, "You're not a real girl, And she was very amused by that. She said, "Oh, is that so?" And then it ended, see? And I had a very clear image of this girl. So she was beautiful. She had very light complexion, maybe a little bit of freckles around the nose, and dark auburn hair. She had on a black, what I would call a knit top. She had a black modern top on. And I had a very clear image of her face. So what I did is when I woke up, I immediately got on Google. I immediately got on Google Images, and I put in woman, portrait. And I went through a great many of them, and I pulled out 13 of them, which looked in one way or another like the girl I had just seen in the dream. And they're all rather similar looking. I have never shown all of them in any presentation. I've talked about it in a speech, and I talk about it in my book, but I've only shown it the best representative examples. I've never shown them all. Now, this is very tricky in terms of copyrights. I only have permission to show one of them. And one or two of them are underage. One's definitely underage. Now, Matthew knew Abby from very young, from, 10 or something like that, when she probably started tutoring him when he was 14 or even younger, because she was a child prodigy and she had a very advanced tutored European style education. Now, that's another thing somebody might bring up as a question, and that is that in that era, American girls were basically tutored in preparation for marriage. They were taught piano and they were taught cooking and sewing and, but European girls were given a full education, and she was being raised French, which I can prove. So she would have had the whole thing, and she would have been in a position to pass this along to Matthew from very young. So one of these girls is very young. I don't know their identities. I tried to get permission from the other ones and never got an answer back from the photographer. I'm not using just a portion of them. I'm using the whole image. I'm still going to claim fair use. This is for science. This is for real research. And you can't prove something. You know, if skeptics say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, you can't provide extraordinary evidence with one hand tied behind your back. So I can save the editing file for this. If I ever get a cease and desist, I can re-edit it, you know, and take the images out and put up some notice to the effect that I took the images out. But for now, with with 3 people watching and nobody watching this far in the video, see, because I don't think any of you are going to be watching this far. So I'm going to show all of them in sequence. And I'll start now and edit this in and then pick up after they're finished. All right, you have seen all 13 images, and now I'm going to show you Abby's portrait, but first I'll tell you how I found it. I knew, and this is going to be repetition from February 14. I knew that one of Matthew's first cousins, Ruth Whittier Shute, who was married to a Dr. Shute, was an itinerant portrait painter who did miniature portraits, traveled around and did them, and she was based in Dover, New Hampshire, the same place that Abby and Matthew eloped to. So I figured that if anybody had painted Abby's portrait, it would be Ruth Whittier Shute, and I should be able to find it. And quite a few of the portraits attributed to her are unidentified. And I thought if I can find one that, maybe I can find Abby's. So I went through them and I went through them. I didn't see anything that remotely rang a bell to me or seemed like it would have been Abby. And then I told a friend of mine about it. She's a member of my own spiritual group, a follower of Mayor Baba. I won't identify her, except to say that she had a visitation dream from Abby. Also, the only other person in the world that I know of that's ever had a visitation dream from Abby. And she said she woke up from it convinced that Abby's real. I just put it out there. I can't say any more about that. But I was visiting her and telling her about my efforts to try to find this portrait by Ruth Whittier Shute. And she says, well, let me look. Let's see if I can find it. So, of course, we Google Ruth Whittier Shute. We're going through the images, and I'm looking over her shoulder. And suddenly I say, stop, look, stop, click on that thumbnail right there. And she brought it up. Of course, it was for auction. And it's Abby. I've proved it many times over since then. Circumstantially, I can prove that that's Abby because Matthew described her many times in both stories and poems. So when you triangulate all of these descriptions, on this one portrait, they all, you've got a petite, beautiful girl who looks rather like a queen, who's very light complected with auburn hair. Now, most of the time, Matthew calls her eyes azure. There's a couple references, one by Abby in her poetry or her story, and one by Matthew that her eyes were indeterminate. And one of them, I think, says green. Well, I looked that up, and it turns out that people with very light complexion, their eyes look blue in certain light because they don't have much pigment, and that makes their eyes look blue. But it kind of depends on who's looking and how the light is and, the angle or whatever. So she probably liked having blue eyes, and so Matthew always referred to her as having blue eyes. But there's a couple references that you couldn't quite tell what color they were, so that's exactly correct. So I determined that that is indeed Abby, and I will now put that up on the screen, and you hopefully can remember or can go back and look at the other portraits and see that it's well beyond chance. Would you say? You can just pick portraits at random. Go on Google and say woman portrait and just pick them at random if you can figure out how to randomize that. And you won't get portraits that look that much like Abby. Some of these are very, very close. Some of them are not quite so close. Now, the portrait does not show any freckles, but I'm telling you that Abby had some little freckles, and I'm telling you that she hated them. So Ruth Whittier Shute, knowing that, politely refrained from putting in any of the freckles. But they were there, and I loved them. I remember that. These are the kind of things you remember. You don't remember what date something was or all the things that skeptics want you to remember. You don't remember those things. You remember stuff like the beloved freckles. So because it's emotional memory that people most readily have. So that's the story. I'm not quite sure how to wrap it up. It's like that reading hits on 10 points? I didn't tally them as I was going through them, but it was very accurate. And it was clearly real. So there's other types of proof that I won't go into that have to do with our communication, which was validated, and synchronicities that, were validated. Some of those are in other videos. If you go into my video section, you'll see an early interview where I talk about some of those. I've forgotten a lot of them. I've had direct connection with Abby. One time, I guess I have permission to talk about this. One time, just on impulse, I put my hands out and I said, "Come to me," and she did. It was electrical. It was like this beautiful, blissful, static electricity, but it was very tangible and very physical. And it persisted as long as I held my arms out. Now, the only question there is, was it Abby or somebody else? I'm assuming it was Abby, but it was real. Let me tell you, that was real spirit contact. And it was responsive and it was immediate. So I have no question, that this is real after 11 years. But boy, does this isolate me, because who can I tell? And now, why did I go public? There's other people experiencing this kind of relationship. You may be one of them. Why did I go public? Because I felt it was disrespectful to Abby not to hide her, to hide the most important person in my life and my relationship and pretend that it didn't exist. Well, I do. If somebody asks me, I see my ring, I say, "Are you married?" I'll say no, because what am I going to do? Go into it with a store clerk? What am I going to do? Yeah, I'm married to a spirit, somebody in heaven, I could do that. And if they're Christian, they might go for it, but you're going to get people going like this, and then there's the possibility of me trying to get a job and being rejected for this. There's the fact that I'll be ridiculed by any historians or academicians that I try to approach about my evidence concerning Matthew's plagiarized work. My family, if they look me up, my extended family will probably back away from me. All potential friends will back away from me. It's a choice you make. What's more important? I made my choice. That's all. So anyway, for those of you who stuck with all of this and who have an interest, I hope you did find it interesting. And thank you once again for watching.